How do you take something that's really heavy and lighten the load? Today, I want to talk about humor, not as a distraction and not as denial, but as a survival tool that actually changes what pain does inside your body and your mind. We already know that the body doesn't just experience pain psychologically, it responds physically. When we laugh, the body releases endorphins, which act as natural painkillers or natural pain regulators. And research on humor in recovery shows us something very important. Humor can support hope, connection, and even resilience when things are hard to carry alone. I want to be careful here. This isn't about just be positive, toxic positivity, or even hashtag be positive. And it's not about turning trauma into something funny. That would be inappropriate. It's about what happens when humor becomes a way to stay present inside something difficult without disappearing from it. For me, humor has always been one of my default ways for coping. Maybe you can relate. Not because everything feels light or everything's meant to be silly or jokey, but because it helps make things survivable. When I started speaking publicly about my experiences, I noticed something happening. If every moment stays heavy, it becomes overwhelming for people in the room. You lose the room. And honestly, you can lose yourself in that heaviness as well. So I started experimenting with humor intentionally, not to avoid the subject, but to be able to stay in it longer while reducing the heaviness. At one point, I enrolled in stand-up. And one of the exercises that we were given in our training was to write a list of things that we disliked about ourselves and turn it into our bit, into the material we'd use for our stand-up routine. But something really interesting happened. By repeating, shaping, and performing those insecurities that I had, they started to lose some of their charge. And that experience changed how I understood humor completely. I also took a course called Writing Sadness Through Humor. And one of the most important ideas from this course was this: you're not making fun of the painful event itself. You're noticing the strange, human, and sometimes absurd things that happen around that event. That shift matters because it allows two things to exist at once: the reality of what happened and your ability to cope with the reality of what happened. Humor, when it's used well, doesn't erase pain, it creates space around the pain. And space is what allows people to think again, to process what they've gone through. Using humor invites that space. Let me show you what I mean. Sometimes when I do public speaking, I'll run little interactive workshops. And one of them is about how to tell a sad story using humor. So here's an image of someone in a bathroom stall. Okay, so if we think about what sad story might this image tell? So it might be being bullied, whether at work or at school. It might be about loneliness, not having anyone to eat lunch with, feeling stressed out, so you need a place to hide, and sometimes a bathroom cubicle is the only place you can do that. Maybe you're embarrassed. Maybe you've had a really difficult day and you're having a good cry. There's so many sad stories that this one image could tell, right? But then what funny anecdotes might surround that sad story? And why would we want to tell funny anecdotes around the sad story? So for instance, if you want to tell a sad story, maybe you need to tell a story about something really awful that happened to you, but you don't want it to be really heavy. Maybe you want to share it, again, in a public speaking context, or maybe if you're in college and you have to give a presentation and you want to talk about something that happened to you, you want to tell that story, but you don't want to create this heaviness in the room. One way you can still tell the story is do it through humor. So you share funny anecdotes around the sad story. So what funny anecdotes might surround this sad story? Well, I might be dating myself, but let's go back to Seinfeld. Do you remember the episode, Can You Spare a Square? And let's say you're having that experience. Your boss is in the stall next to you and asks for, can you spare a square? And maybe the reason why you're even in the washroom is because you got disciplined by your boss moments before. That would actually be a really funny story. Or perhaps you experience accidental oversharing between coworkers. Maybe two people come in the washroom and you're hearing the conversation they're having. Or perhaps you're identifying different people coming in the washroom through the sound of their shoes. I remember my college students used to say, we knew that was you coming down the hall because of the way my shoes sounded. It's pretty funny. Or someone on the phone denying that they're in the washroom, and then someone flushes the toilet or blow dryers go off. Or someone in another stall waiting for someone to flush before making bodily noises. I think we can all relate to that. Or even mirror-facing complaints or pep talks by coworkers who don't realize that they're not alone in the washroom. And then, of course, salacious gossip. Bottom line, same setting, you're in a washroom, different framing. So while you're maybe talking about these funny anecdotes and experiences you're having, you also have the opportunity to share about the reason why you're in the washroom. So for instance, if we talked about you just got in trouble by your boss, maybe you got written up for something and you're hiding in the washroom, and that's the sad story you want to talk about, why maybe you don't think it's fair or why it upset you or how unjust it was. And then lo and behold, your boss is in the stall next to you asking you for toilet paper. That would actually be a really funny story. But you get my point. You can talk about a sad story, an event that caused a lot of distress, but sharing funny anecdotes around that story allows you to tell the sad story in a less heavy manner. So what changes isn't the facts, it's what your mind is allowed to notice about those facts. That's one of the quiet powers of humor. And for me, that became especially important during recovery, being able to find the humor in things that weren't funny at the time. For instance, at the hospital, I was there for a month in rehab for a month, and there were a lot of really unhappy, not funny things that I was experiencing that later became part of the funny story. And I even have a list of things that I would now consider funny that weren't funny at the time. And one of the stories that I wrote for the Writing Sadness Through Humor course with Second City is one that I often share now when I do public speaking events, because it dealt with the importance that I placed on the superficial. And one example is I didn't look in the mirror for 3 weeks. So I was in a coma for the first week, and then I was unable to get up and go use the washroom. So again, funny, had to wear an adult diaper. Not funny now, not funny then, but you can find a funny anecdote around it, which I do have. Nevertheless, the first time I looked in the mirror in the bathroom, even though my face was all scarred and swollen from reconstructive jaw surgery, the very first thing I noticed when I looked in the mirror was that I had a whole bunch of gray hair. And that became part of the funny story I tell, how we place so much importance on the superficial that even in the extreme situation that I was in, my first thoughts went to the gray hair that I had instead of why my face was so distorted at the time. Another story that I share that I wrote from the Second City course, Writing Sadness Through Humor, is talking about the flirtations of the social worker and how I was aesthetically compromised, gray hair, swollen face, hospital gown, frumpy and ugly, feeling ugly, and I'm observing a social worker flirt with my husband. So telling that story of angst, but using humor about the aesthetics that I had, allowed me to share a story about something that was heavy, but do it in a light way. So what I've learned is that humor doesn't erase the pain, and it doesn't make difficult experiences smaller or less real or invalidate them, but it can create enough space inside them to stay present instead of shutting down. In my case, humor didn't take me out of what I was going through, it just helped me cope with what I was going through. And sometimes that's what healing actually looks like, right? Not resolution, not clarity, just moments of lightness that you can allow you to breathe again. So when I think back to everything that I went through, I don't just remember the hardest parts. I also remember the moments that made me laugh, because there were quite a few of them. And somehow both are part of the same story. And if there's one thing that I can leave you with, it's this: that humor isn't the opposite of seriousness. Sometimes it's how we survive that seriousness. Take a look at the next video where I talk about the expressive writing process. And expressive writing can be done with humor. So if you want to give it a try, maybe take notes about something that's really bothering you, a sad story that you want to tell, and then think about all of the funny anecdotes that surround that sad story and just write. Thanks for watching. See you next time.